Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in our series of live career webinars brought to you by the HOP platform. So HOP is a website that we hope that all schools and young people in Hertfordshire are aware of and will be using in school and outside school, because it's a resource that will help you arrive at careers, destinations, decisions. So some of you are at very crucial points of your careers where you're perhaps just about to finish GCSEs, just about to finish sixth form, college, or perhaps even about to finish university, or perhaps you're helping someone. You may be a parent of a young person who's on that journey at the moment. So HOP is a one-stop shop for careers, advice and guidance. All of the webinars that we record on here, we've been recording these for 3 years now. I think there's over 70 different webinars covering different subjects, are all available to watch back on our HOP channels. So do familiarise yourself with the website and our social media handles. The purpose of this webinar is to give you an insight into what a career as a medical writer is. Now, that's a career that, I'll be honest with you, until about 4 weeks ago, I had no idea existed. So I'm really excited to explore this a little bit further. And we have got two experts from this field who work as medical writers currently, who can tell you a little bit about their experiences and their stories and give you some advice and guidance about what your next steps should be. A little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so it will be available on the HOP webinar, on our HOP platforms from tomorrow. If you can't stay till the end of it, or if you've got a friend or a family member who you think would enjoy watching this, then of course you can share it with them. So do have a look at our YouTube channel and our compilation of videos, and look at the HOP website. You'll find it from there. Just to reassure you, we can't see or hear any of you that are watching this. It's just gone 4:30 on Thursday afternoon. So firstly, if you come home from school or college and you're tuning in to watch this, then well done. I think this is a great investment in your time. To make the most of it though, you can submit any questions. So anything that we're talking about that you'd like to know a little bit more about, or perhaps things that we don't cover that you want to know more about, you can submit your questions to one of our or both of our panelists so they can answer it for you. So it's your opportunity to have a real interaction with an expert or an employee of a medical writing organisation to find out more from them. The way that you do that, on your dashboard, you've got the questions tab. If you click on that, it opens out a text box. Type your question in there. It will come through. It'll only be visible to me, and then I can direct that question to either Helen or Sven. So do get those questions in. There's a couple that came in actually when you registered, so we're going to cover both of those. So one about whether are historical medical records still useful to today, and what advice would you have for an aspiring science writer or journalist. So if you have any questions, we will answer those throughout the process of this webinar. But without going any further, I want to make sure that you know who our panelists are today. So good afternoon, Helen.
Hi, welcome all. I'm Helen Norman. I work for the pharmaceutical company Roche, and I, like it was introduced, I'm a team leader. I oversee a team of medical writers within the pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, Sven.
Hello everyone, my name is Sven Fritz. I'm a principal medical writer and I work at a company called DLRC. We are a consultancy and we help our clients to navigate, lots of medicines, and I work with a team of writers that help me with that.
Okay, thank you. Well, we look forward to finding out more about both of you. But first of all, the question I want to ask you is, tell us a little bit more about what your company does. So Helen, tell us a little bit about Roche.
Yep, so Roche is a global pharmaceutical company. So this is a company that develops medicines, and we cover a whole range of diseases. So we have a big oncology portfolio, so into the cancer treatment, and then lots in neuroscience, ophthalmology, infectious diseases, inflammation. So we cover a whole broad range of disease areas. As I said, we're a global company, but we do have a UK office, and that UK office is in Welwyn Garden City. And so that's my office location when I go to work.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm sure everyone watching this will be aware of Welwyn Garden City, and they're pretty accessible for all of you to get to. It's right smack bang in the middle of the county, and they're fantastic facilities over there as well. I'm fortunate enough to have been over there several times. It's a great working environment to be in. Sven, tell us a little bit more about DLRC then.
Sure. So DLRC, we are a consultancy, also DLRC Group. Our head office is in Letchworth Garden City. We do have a global outreach. We're also established in the US, and we have another outfit in Germany. There's about 120 of us, and we don't have any products that are our own on the market. So there are no medicines that come through us. What we do is we help clients to develop medicines. So people can come to us, they might have an idea, they might be at later stages, but they don't know what to do next. And what we do is we look at what they're doing, what their product is, what the new medicine is, and what the challenges might be, and then we help them along the process so that they can get it on the market and so that the medicine can help people.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So any more questions that you might have about specifically about Roche or DLRC or anything you just heard in that introduction, please do drop it in and we will cover that. But first of all, 4 weeks ago, I didn't know there was such a role as a medical writer. So tell us, Sven, what is a medical writer? And then perhaps what are the different branches of it? Because you explained to me before we came on that there are maybe two main strands. So if you could just explain those, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, sure. So a medical writer in general is somebody who takes information, could be all sorts of information, and creates a medical document from it. So information to output the document. But there are two branches really. There's medical communications and there's regulatory medical writing. And the difference is perhaps really the level of creativity that you have. So regulated medical writing that Helen and I do, there's a lot of regulations and guidelines around that you have to keep to. So you have to follow these exactly. You have to make sure you have the exact content that somebody needs to, for example, make sure that a medicine is safe. But in medical communications, you have a more creative part. So these would be things like newspaper articles, flyers, maybe even TV adverts. So, you have all the graphics, all the colors of the rainbow available to you to convince people to use a medicine.
Sure. Okay, thank you. I think that really paints the picture very nicely. Helen, when we were speaking beforehand, I said that you guys are both medical writers, but do you consider yourself as a scientist first and foremost?
I do really consider myself as a scientist, and I would say that all of my colleagues who I work with will as well. We do all have scientific backgrounds at degree level within our company who do the medical writing, and so science is my passion. This is a way of me using my scientific skills, so I definitely still identify as a scientist.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's very clear. There's perhaps this very old idea that science and language skills are diametrically opposed, so you can't be one or the other. But actually, what you're explaining here is that the science community needs people with good writing skills who are first and foremost scientists and got really good technical knowledge and understanding of various scientific concepts. So, well, let's try and delve into what a day in the life looks like for both of you. So Helen, before coming on this webinar today, tell us what sort of things are in your in tray on a daily basis.
Sure. So I would start by saying there is no average day or average week, and that's what's kept me involved for so long, in that things change on a frequent basis. Most of our writers are working on multiple documents in parallel across many different disease areas and different stages of development. So there's always something new to keep you excited. So a typical day or week may look like planning out the content for a document. So what data are we going to have? How is that going to be presented in tables and graphs so we can look at the data and get those scientific messages from the data? What key messages are we going to try and get from the data? So there could be that planning piece. There could be the doing piece, so actively writing that data up, looking at the big tables that we get and trying to get those scientific messages across. We also work really closely with lots of our colleagues. So while we identify experts, so we have experts in the statistical field or experts in clinical safety or clinical science. And so there's a lot of collaboration with our team, with our colleagues, in terms of making sure that we are conveying those messages correctly, that we have the right scientific interpretation into those documents. Then, in addition to that, we have about 40 writers in Welwyn, and so there's lots of knowledge sharing forums where our writers get together and can ask advice. So there's a good community aspect to it too.
Okay, right, Sven, I'm going to try and ask this question without sounding like your boss, but what have you been doing today?
I'll try and answer that. So quite similar to Helen, to be honest, very collaborative. But in general, my day starts with a fairly structured morning where I try and get all my writing done, and that's the same for all my team members, really. And the reason for that is that in the afternoon, we typically have a lot of client calls and so on. So the morning is really our concentration time, if you will. And for me as a team leader, around lunchtime, thereabouts, I try and check in on all my team members, at least once a week with everyone. Make sure they're okay, make sure they have work to do, they're happy, and everything's going well. And then in the afternoon, and that's perhaps a difference here for sort of the small business DLRC and consultancy side, we tend to provide a lot of advice. So we have these half an hour or 1 hour client calls where we talk with people around the world that fire questions at us. And like Helen just said, that's really enjoyable because no day is the same. No question is ever the same. You have to deal with different cultures, different scenarios really quickly. Sometimes, obviously, we go back, we work on whatever issue they have, and we help them over a certain period of time as well. And these things can then become new projects that we work on.
Sure. Okay. Well, Helen, you've alluded to the fact that this is a role you've been in for a while and you really enjoy it. So what are the best parts of the job?
I am a scientist, so staying close to the science is probably one of the things that I enjoy most. So when you get the first look at the data to see whether it's worked or not, and is it safe or not, there's a real buzz when you get to analyze that piece with the team. And then, like I alluded to, that teamwork. So there's a whole team of people who are delivering these documents together. And so there's that real camaraderie about pulling together to deliver on it. So there are a couple of the things that I enjoy most.
Sure. And Sven, same question to you.
It's quite similar, really. I think for me, perhaps also phrase it as learning. I really like sort of that continuous learning. Like I learn something new every day, almost every hour, as I work on things, as I see the newest medical developments around the world. So it can be really interesting as well, especially if that's your personal interest and that's an area that you really like.
Sure. Okay. And then the flip question to that is, what's challenging about the role? What are the difficult things with being a medical writer, Helen?
So while working as part of a team can be great, sometimes you will get team members who are behind on providing their contributions or behind on reviewing the documents. So there can be some chasing of people to get them to do their job sometimes. But in general, it's really collaborative.
Sure. Okay. And Sven, again, same question to you. What's challenging about being a medical writer?
Perhaps sort of two things to add. One is cultures as well. So as you can hear by my accent, I come from a different culture. You have to be very good to adjusting to all sorts of different things around the world. So that can sometimes be very challenging. Also, for example, timeline expectations and things like that. And the other thing is you are obviously spending a lot of time in front of a screen, so you have to be very active with finding a balance to that. So that might mean going for a run every morning or having some sort of other very active hobby so that you can balance out your day sitting down.
Sure. Okay. A question that's come in, and it was in my mind as well, so I'm pleased that the question came in, is what's the length of writing that you'd be completing? Again, we're not talking about that's creative writing or medical communication. So getting that from a regulatory side, what we're talking, a couple of sides of A4's worth, or we're talking short, sharp, concise bits of writing?
So I'll take that one, Sven, first, and you can add to it. So one of the main documents that we write up is something called clinical study reports. So for every drug, it has to be tested in the patient population to prove that it's worked and to prove that it's safe. And so these clinical study reports can be huge. So the main body of the report can be 150, 200 pages. But when we add in all of the appendices to the documents, I've seen ones up to 4,000, 8,000 pages. But the main bit that we write is probably 200 pages as a rough guess.
Sure.
Yeah, and then on top of that, once you actually completed the program, you might need to do, let's say, 20 clinical studies to have enough, data to try and put your new medicine on the market. And once you have that, you have 20 of those that Helen just mentioned, and then you need to write summaries and overviews of all of these and assemble this in a very large dossier, it's called, and then you might have tens of thousands of pages that actually, get compiled and looked at one point.
Sure. And are you always following a template or a structure to put those reports together, or is there an element of creativity about how you actually put all those words together?
Most documents have a set format, so there are various ICH guidelines that kind of state what needs to be included in the document. So a lot of it is fairly set in place. Some of the documents have a little bit more freedom depending on the data that you're presenting and what's important for that molecule to have a little bit of debate or discussion on what's included, but sometimes it needs to follow a set process, because this is what the health authority, so who we actually submit these documents to, they have certain things that they need to be able to see to say whether the drug is safe and whether it works.
Sure. Well, I mean, Sven, that was going to be my follow-up question. Who is the audience when you're writing these reports? Who actually reads them?
So very, very important. Target audience is one of the first things that medical writers really learn, because obviously you don't want to spend hours and weeks producing something that's not made for the person that you want to give it to. So most of our documents, they are meant for people at authorities. So somebody at an authority, for example, in the UK, the MHRA, which regulates medicines, would read it and make sure that the medicine is safe. So what we would do is we would follow their guidelines and make sure, they see many of them. They want to always have the same structure to quickly do their work. But then on the opposite side of this, we often also write documents that are for patients, and that's actually something that's becoming more and more important. Like there's a transparency movement in general, making sure that this isn't a secretive industry that nobody can follow, making sure that it's very open. And that brings with it new types of documents that are meant for normal people. Actually, the average reading age in the UK is 12 years of age, and sometimes we have to write documents that are geared towards that.
Sure. And is this the same again for prescription? So if I'm thinking I've got to administer some medicine for one of my children, I've often had an instruction sheet which is often folded lots of times, and I have to open it out and work out actually how I apply that medicine. I mean, is that the role of a medical writer to put those sorts of instruction guides together? Helen, let me go to you.
Yeah, so we have input into the label, that's what you're referring to. And so the label includes, is the drug safe? What side effects might you have? How should you take it? How often should you take it? And so, yeah, as a medical writer, you can get involved in writing that label. And like Sven said, that's very different in terms of the language that you would use, rather than submitting to the health authorities who have that scientific background. So the label has to be much more day-to-day use rather than really complex scientific terms that are used.
Sure, and I mean, Sven, you've alluded to it in different cultures as well, but presumably medicines are being made and they're not just going to one country where only one language is spoken here. So this is something that's got to be translatable into many different languages so that it doesn't lose its meaning?
Correct. So most of our work is in English, and in general, sort of that's the working language that everyone can review and so on. But once the actual review is done, when patient-centered documents go out, they are going to be translated. There's a huge demand for that. Imagine just across the European Union, how many languages you could possibly need as well.
Sure. Okay, well, look, that's a nice segue into the next couple of questions I wanted to ask, which is how you get into medical writing. So there's the question that many people watching this at the moment will be thinking, have I picked the right GCSEs? What should I do? Are there A-levels I need to do? Do I need to go to a particular type of university? And Helen, let me just start with you. I mean, obviously, clearly, science was something that appealed to you from quite a young age, and it was something area that you probably knew you wanted to go into. Had you ever considered the importance of having those really good writing skills at that point?
No, I'll be completely honest. When I was picking my GCSEs and A-levels, I did not have a clue what I wanted to do career-wise. So I really focused on picking subjects that I enjoyed and that also I was good at. We're going to have a working career for many years, so I think it's really important to focus on those things you enjoy. So I did biology, chemistry and maths A-levels, and still didn't really know what I wanted to do at that point. And so then I ended up really enjoying the biology aspects of my A-level and did a degree in pharmacology. So this is closely linked to pharmacy and the pharmacists that you see, but focuses a little bit more on how the drugs work in the body rather than the dosing aspect. And I absolutely loved the theory behind it all and really, really enjoyed my degree. I was also fortunate to do a year in industry as part of my degree. So my third year, I actually went and worked for Roche in the States. And I was in a lab. I was doing scientific experiments on a daily basis. And while I loved the theory and the big picture of where my science was leading, I just decided that lab work wasn't for me at that point. And so at that point, it was a case of exploring what can I do with science that's not in the lab. I obviously had exposure to the pharmaceutical industry for that year. And so that was my starting point, and effectively stumbled across regulatory affairs and medical writing and just decided it was something that really appealed to me.
Sure, and then Sven, same question to you. I mean, talk us right back to when you were at school. I appreciate you went to school in a different country, so we might not be comparing apples with apples here, but talk us through your journey.
That's okay. I use some parallels from my children. So basically, I hated writing actually when I was at school. I never liked writing. I was really good at maths and the science things. So that's the route I went down. It ended up being chemistry for me. But in general, you know, between biology, chemistry, and these sorts of things, these tend to be the traditional pathways that a lot of medical writers have, really. And then I took it from there and went to university. So a university pathway is that also something that we see in a lot of medical writers, just because that's very similar to the work we do, you know, researching something and writing about it, assembling it into something like a thesis. So in general, subject-wise, you are essentially looking at the science subjects, some math, maybe physical education could be something as well that's really useful.
So both of you have done very science-heavy A-levels or equivalent and degrees, but do you think there's room to go in and do, would it help if you did a subject where you're learning to write and coherently and put sort of arguments and cases forward? What would you recommend? So if someone's watching this at the moment, how important is it, do you think, that they maybe drop in an English or a history in there? How useful might that be? Helen, I'm going to go to you first because you'll be more familiar with perhaps the landscape of A-level choices and subjects.
Yeah, I think having an English as a first language, like Sven said, or not a first language, but as a fluent language, sorry. So an ability to write comprehensively in English is essential for the role. There are definitely, you know, what you mentioned about arguments and persuasion, some of that can be really useful in some of our documents. So analysing data or analysing the pros and cons of something and then coming up with a conclusion from that can be beneficial too. The science, I would say, is essential, being able to understand what you're writing about. But like you say, you know, any subject that involves essay writing, you know, is going to be beneficial in terms of structuring your document with your introductions, your detail, and then concluding at the end. Sure.
What you're saying is ultimately do this role, you are going to be writing in volume, aren't you? So being able to put those that structure together is really important. Sven, you said you went on to university. Knowing what you know about the industry now, have you got to go to university to get a role within science and medical writing, or are there other routes in?
I think in general for regulatory itself, there are some other routes in, so the regulatory area, sort of the big umbrella area, if you will. But if you specialize into something like medical writing, where you are very skilled at looking at large volumes of data and summarizing them, then a university degree is something that teaches you that. So that is very often something that employers will look for. There isn't really, you know, the university degree itself might not really be that important. We see, for example, people coming in that have IT degrees, you know, programming, something that's very similar from a skill set, and then they come through the data pathway where they're very focused on data and very good on that and come to writing. But in general, the university degree is always something that's sort of the base level for it. And then you sort of have different levels for, you know, the main sort of expectation for the higher roles is often a PhD, but that doesn't mean you have to go all the way to PhD level. There are a lot of opportunities on a master level, and you gain experience as well, or even on the bachelor's level as well. So here at DLRC, for example, we offer a graduate program where people come to us and they can work various functions and see what they actually like before they decide, what full-on degree pathway they want to follow.
Sure, okay. And you know what? I asked that question without seeing the question. It's just been submitted from Emily. So, Helen, let me ask you this question. Do you have to do a science degree at university to be a science writer?
I'm trying to recall so we have a graduate program as well, and I think we do specify a science degree currently. What we are increasingly aware of is the cost of going to university and how that may be prohibitive. And so the diversity inclusion piece for our companies is a really big focus. And so we are looking at what other ways people may be able to demonstrate those skills, those experiences without having gone to university. But currently, having the science degree shows that you are familiar with science, you can look at data and you understand what's going on. So I would say it is kind of an essential for now.
Sure, okay. I should say, I mean, both of your organisations I know are very good and been very forward thinking in the fields of apprenticeships as well at various levels too. So it could well be, so don't discount the fact that there are opportunities to go in to this sort of career, or certainly into working for science companies through an apprenticeship route, possibly even at degree apprenticeship level. So we've asked the question about, do you need to go to university or looking at courses? I mean, I guess it's just that level of technical science knowledge, Helen, isn't it, that's going to help, that a 3-year plus science degree is going to help you with, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'd come back to how I chose my A-levels in terms of picking a subject that you're interested in. So the field of science degrees is huge, and so to really think about something that you're going to be interested in spending the next 3 or 4 years and then future career studying.
Sure, okay. So we always ask the question about, if I know everyone would love to have a week's work experience at either Roche or at DLRC, and that's not always possible for logistical reasons, but are there any experiences that young people could be gaining that will help them whilst they're still at school? What would you recommend, Sven, for things to be doing outside of your studies that will help you get a bit of a grasp of whether you want to be a science medical writer?
Yeah, so I think for me, it kind of splits into two things. There are things that you could show a potential employer, and there are sort of things that you can do yourself sort of to build your interests. And for the latter one, really, obviously, an interest in healthcare is really important. So, that could be just learning about your own health, about nutrition and all the many basic things. So, for example, one of my team members is a big fan of traditional medicine, Ayurveda and things like that. And she learned that from very on. So things like that, you could develop. But equally, on the other side, things that you can show to your employer, there are obviously all these science competitions that you could potentially go to, science projects that you can work on, and interests that you can build up on with time as well. And perhaps, like you've mentioned before, also maybe some sort of writing experience, although it doesn't have to be what you really like, but in a modern world, you can do blog posts, YouTube, all sorts of involvement, any of these sort of forums you could use and show that you can take information and produce something, for a specific target.
Sure. Okay. I mean, Helen, when did you learn that you had an aptitude to write and to write well? Could you, if you think back to when you were doing, GCSE English literature, for instance, where you would have been writing essays, was that something you look back on and think, oh, actually, maybe I was better at that than I thought I was?
It's a good question. So I think I actually struggled more with English literature and English language because it's less fact-based. And so when I was writing my essays in biology, for instance, where it was really focused on the facts and conveying those facts, I found that an easier approach. I've also been a stickler for good punctuation and grammar, which very much dates me, but that's something that I've always been interested in. And so, that feeds into the writing piece as well quite well.
Sure. Okay. And by the way, thank you for the question, Emily. If you've got any questions that you want to ask, if you're watching this live at the moment, do submit them. We will go through them. I'm going to ask actually a question that came in during the registration. I'm keen to get your thoughts on it, which is, what advice would you have for an aspiring science writer / journalist? So, Sven, we spoke about this being perhaps a slightly different strand of medical writing. This is more around the medical communications, but what sort of things would be good to go and research, or what would be good preparation for this sort of career? It's what you want to aspire to.
So for this area, you're kind of becoming a bit more artsy. So things like a portfolio become a lot more important. So you could obviously, try and already bring yourself in with things if you find little projects here and there, school projects and so on, that you can do and develop these skills. What we do here is obviously writing, but within medical communications, things like design are becoming a lot more important. Things like guidance around that, little comics, for example, sad child turning happy with a medicine, all these sorts of things. So you can, with time, slowly develop these skills already, and then you have something to talk about when you go for your first interviews, as you try and gain entry in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. Helen, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I think the other thing is to watch and see how science is conveyed in the media. So how does, for instance, the BBC News, how do they share their health stories, and look at the language that they're using to convey, and obviously the COVID situation and how all of that was portrayed in the media in terms of trying to explain those really scientific, complex processes and ideas to the general population. So how some of that was done. The other thing you could take a look at is some of the scientific journals. So there are thousands of scientific journals, but you could have a look at some of the big ones like Nature in terms of how science is discussed and shared, and how writers in those spaces have to use different language to convey their understandings and their research.
Sure. You just mentioned medical journals there and things that are perhaps already out there. And there was a really good question that came in that pre-registration, which is, are historical medical reports still useful today? So do you often find yourselves having to scan through some historical medical reports? And if so, do you still use them? That's Sven.
Yes and no. So any medical information out there is useful, and new research is built on old information. So you can always trace it back. And that is something that we do in things like literature searches, where we look for existing literature and we try and sort of gauge, what's already out there, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. There are also some recent examples where there are new medicines developed on old concepts, for example. New medicines based on things that have been researched very, very early on, like natural compounds, plant-based compounds, and so on. And then obviously it's really helpful to go back and see what happened, what safety problems did they have when they used it like 100 years ago, for example. But then there's a no part to it. Obviously, you have to sort of qualify it and make sure that it applies to your case. Is it actually useful? That's also where the skill of a medical writer comes in, to check the data, check the information, and make sure it's useful for what you're going to produce.
Yeah, I mean, Helen, is that something at Roche that you're frequently doing? Are you looking at some historical medical reports?
We do have to. So if we were to talk about, approved treatments, or how frequent a certain disease area or disease was occurring, we have to have facts to back those up. So if you get into scientific writing or lots of styles of writing, you will have to find literature references to back up what you're saying. We can't just say something without having something to justify that from. So as Sven mentioned, doing literature searches to get that background information and to justify why we're saying certain things is useful. The science does evolve quickly, and so what may have been proved right 50 years ago, as technology advances, as our scientific understanding advances, may no longer be relevant. So that's what Sven said in terms of there is that judgment piece in terms of is this still relevant, or has our understanding moved on so much from then that, you know, this really isn't relevant to what we're looking at now?
Okay. Right, next question. I'm always slightly nervous when I ask this question because I'm looking for a very specific answer. And the question is Hertfordshire a good place if you want to go into medical writing and life sciences in general? So Helen, let me come to you first.
Yes. Roche is a fantastic company to work for, and I haven't been paid to say that now. It is also not the only pharmaceutical company in Hertfordshire, so there's lots in the area that you can explore. So yes.
Yeah, that was the answer I was looking for, by the way. Thank you. Sven, now I know, sort of taking it from behind the fourth wall here, you're actually located yourself up in Leicestershire, aren't you? But DLRC are in Letchworth, and presumably that's somewhere you come down to. And do you feel like you're going into a hub of life sciences and medical writing fraternities when you come down here?
Yes, and you know, medical writing, there tend to be a lot of home-based people, so there are certain focus areas within the UK, and Hertfordshire is definitely one of them. So especially we at DLRC, as a smaller company, we work with a lot of other SMEs. There's a large base, you know, like I just mentioned, for example, medical communications, if that's something that you're looking on, as well as in regulatory, loads and loads of little hubs and companies out there that are doing very, very interesting things.
Sure. Okay, good. You both answered that question just as I wanted you to, so well done. Now, the other question that we often like to cover here is, what are the sorts of routes that you could go into as a medical writer? Now, I'm sure both of your bosses and employers are very keen for you to continue doing the jobs you do now fantastically for a very long time, but are there any natural progressions for a medical writer into other strands of science, or perhaps transcending further than that, Sven?
Yeah, so traditionally, there's two traditional pathways. So some people like to stay technical and do a lot of writing and get amazing at that. Some people like the sort of team leadership aspect. So they lead teams of medical writers and they lead the larger projects. You know, imagine you have hundreds of documents that all need to be coordinated and that all need to look similar and have the same message. But then on top of that, obviously, as you go higher up, really, there are still other science-based positions as well. So here at DLRC, obviously, we do a lot of consultancy, and as director of consultancy and things like that, where you manage things like that. But I know that at other organizations, you know, there's science directors, medical directors, people that look, you know, at all the background and make sure that when project starts, they already, you know, have the right goal in mind, so that when things finish, there's an easy job for medical writers and the regulatory professionals.
Sure. And then, well, Helen, have you got anything to add to that? And secondly, just the reverse of that, you said you're first and foremost a scientist, and medical writing wasn't necessarily what you thought you were going to end up doing. So are there any careers within science that lend themselves to then go into medical writing?
Yeah, so I'll come back to the first question first. So because Roche is a large company, there are many different functions within our Welwyn office and globally. And so people will sometimes move from a medical writing career into more standard regulatory affairs, sometimes moving into some of the scientific roles, so moving closer to the projects in terms of being the oversight for the safety for the molecule, or the scientific running of the studies. You can get involved in that aspect too. And also we do have people to transition sort of more into the marketing roles of the company as well. So you're then speaking more closely with nurses and doctors, etc. So you need to have that scientific background and how we market our drugs. So that was the first part. Second part, remind me your question again, apologies.
Yeah, it was more the other routes that people may have done immediately prior to becoming a medical writer.
Yeah, so we get a lot of from the lab, so scientists who come from the lab and decide to have a change and want to move away from the lab-based one. So that's a really common route. We do actually have people who switch over more from that from the medical communications piece, so the journalist part that we've talked about previously. We do have people who decide to transition into more of the regulatory medical writing too.
Sure. Okay. We've got a few minutes left, so if you have got any more questions, or even if you just want to check, like, I'm thinking about doing these A-levels, or I'm thinking about doing this degree, what do you think? Do drop that in there, and we'll make sure that we get the opportunity to ask those and to get you some answers and some guidance. What I wanted you both to do now, though, is just explain some of the websites that may be useful for people to go and have a look at. So I think, Helen, you gave me both of these. Which ones would you recommend people go and have a look at, and what will they help them with?
So TOPRA is the Association of Professional Regulatory Affairs. So as Sven said, both he and I focus on medical writing within the regulatory part of the industry. And so TOPRA is the group of professionals there. So this can give you a really good understanding in terms of what regulatory affairs is, and then how medical writing can then fit into that. EMWAR, or the European Medical Writers Association, is a group of medical writers from across Europe who I think span beyond regulatory medical writing as well. And so they hold various conferences, and there's a bit of information on the website around what that involves as well. So it's a good place to take a look for more information.
Sven, is there anywhere else you'd direct people, perhaps going beyond websites, or any blogs, podcasts, really good books?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing I would recommend is looking at web pages of pharmaceutical organizations. I mean, there are the big ones, Helen, obviously, at Roche, but, Pfizer, everybody, all the vaccine names that everybody recently came across. And that is something that I always check when I recruit people that are relatively new to the industry. Have they got an awareness of what's out there? Especially nowadays with the new transparency requirements, there is a lot of public information. You can easily learn about all of medical writing really by looking at these web pages and checking what the documents are, what the companies have to send out there. Not everything, but a lot of it. And then there aren't really any specific podcasts in medical writing, but EMBA, for example, that was just shown, they do a monthly magazine that's freely or mostly freely accessible. So I definitely recommend reading various articles. So even if you don't understand it all, at least you sort of get an idea of the concept of what's out there.
Sure. Okay. There's a question here. It's not about A-level choices, but I think it's touching on something that you mentioned, Helen. You spoke about the pandemic earlier, and the question is, has COVID-19 been good for highlighting the importance of science within our communities?
Yes, I do not recall a period in time where science has been top news billing for such a long period of time. I think it also gave an insight into drug development and the processes involved in taking a drug from an idea that might work all the way through to an approved medication. And so I think it's given people a better understanding on that. It also goes to show that, when there is a big pandemic or a big health emergency, that the regulations, there are ways within the regulations that we can use emergency use, etc., to get things through faster, to get them there to where they need to be with the patients.
Sure. I mean, I can remember, Sven, I'll ask you this question. I can remember going to see a session, I think it was at Roche actually, several years ago, way pre-pandemic, and they were talking about the lifespan of getting a drug onto market. So, I mean, what was achieved through the pandemic done for the industry as a whole, Sven? Do you think we'll start seeing drugs brought to market much quicker as a result?
We are already seeing some changes in guidelines, and obviously there's an increased awareness that it shouldn't take that long. And especially here as a smaller company, we advise a lot of clients on how can they, be a little bit quicker, how can they get extra help, and authorities are starting to offer that help. Because like you just said, it might not be acceptable for patients to wait 15, 20 or 30 years for a drug. The quicker, the better.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, is it like the 3-year anniversary today of when we were told that lockdown was starting? So it's quite poignant. But how did bearing all that in mind, how did it affect you as medical writers? Were you having to work through things far quicker than you were previously? Did that affect you as much as it affected the rest of your colleagues in pharmaceuticals?
I didn't work directly on anything related to COVID, but lots of the discussions that we had were how can we still continue getting patients access to the medications? So the molecules that I look after are all focused in cancer. And so how can we still ensure that these patients can get to hospital to get their treatments? And so we had a lot of push to look at moving to a dosing mechanism, so an injection you can do at home so that patients can continue their treatment at home rather than having to go to big specialized hospitals to be able to do that. So that was probably the biggest challenge, and also trying to homeschool while working was probably my other biggest challenge.
Yeah. What about for you, Sven? What was the sort of impact for you on a day-to-day basis working through the pandemic?
So for me specifically, obviously, team, members, everybody is very stressed, situations changing on a daily basis. In general, we writers are pretty good with that. We are used to constant change, but it also became very busy, as you can imagine, with a lot of different clients, with a lot of different molecules. Some of them were repurposed, so they might have been used for something completely different. And then, for whatever reason, there could have been the belief that it might help with COVID. And then clients wanted to explore this and run new studies with these medicines, and then obviously have the documents to support this. As we've seen, for example, the US president at that time had an experimental treatment, and there might have been many, many others out there. Some of them are still being explored at this point in time.
Sure. Okay. Right. I think this is going to be the final question that's coming. It's a good one to ask, actually. Are there many entry-level medical writing opportunities that become available? So I guess that means once you've finished school or once you've graduated from university, is there a role for you straight away as a medical writer, or would your organisations expect that you get some more experience in the workplace within science before becoming a writer? Helen, let me go to you first of all on that one.
So I came into regulatory affairs medical writing straight from university, so it is possible. There are limited availabilities, and so the best bet is trying to look for companies that are running graduate programs to get that entry-level position. Otherwise, you do tend to see the standard 3 to 5 years experience required, so it's just trying to get that piece first is the hardest step probably. But graduate programs are probably the best way in.
Sure. And Sven, is that the same for you within the teams that you lead at DLRC?
So it's quite similar, but the one additional thing I can recommend, if you don't find yourself in a position to be in a graduate program, just try and find smaller companies as well. A lot of smaller companies take on people and train them up. They might not call it a graduate program, but that's what it is. You learn a lot on the job, and then after a few years, it might be in regulatory and regulatory operations or whatever they call it really. But after a few years, if you want to make that step to medical writing, you will find it a lot easier because you have that experience.
Sure, and Sven, you've touched on a really important point there, and I'm pleased that you did as well. So I think we're really keen, particularly with using HOP as a platform, it's to highlight some of those smaller companies that maybe you don't necessarily think of. So I'm sure if we ask most people, who do you think of in Hertfordshire as pharmaceutical companies, probably Roche and GSK would be the ones that come to mind, but there are all these little gems around the county like DLRC who are smaller companies who offer those opportunities and perhaps have some really good internal training programs. Sven, could you just perhaps finish on saying what's it like working for a smaller company, and what are perhaps some of the benefits of working in a smaller company?
Yeah, so I obviously really enjoy it, with the main benefit being variety. I've worked over the decade that I've done this now with such a large variety of clients. Makes you laugh on most days. You come into all sorts of new things, you always learn something new, and it is really, really enjoyable. Then on top of that, I do also enjoy that, you sort of know all the names of the people that you work with in smaller companies, which can be quite nice and makes for sort of a nice dynamic. For example, here at DLRC, we do a really fun team building every year where we go out on adventures. It was camping last year, and volunteering on a farm. Things like that, can be really great.
For sure. Okay, well, look, I think we're about ready to close now. So first of all, on your screen at the moment, again, that's just a reminder of our HOP website and some of our social media handles. The QR code in the top left-hand corner will take you through to our virtual encounters page. So on there are, I think, nearly 70 different webinars like this where we focus on different topics. Last week we spoke about careers in television production. The next one we're going to do, which will be after Easter, will be careers as a cabin crew. So there's a really diverse range of careers that we cover on these webinars. So do have a look at them. Do recommend them to some of your friends as well. Let me just thank firstly the participants, people who have been watching this session live, who have contributed some fantastic and really thoughtful questions. Really hope that this session has been useful for you. But even more particularly, can I thank both Helen and Sven for giving up their time to share their experiences and knowledge with you all today. So Helen and Sven, you've been real heroes today. Thank you so much. And then we wish you all the very best with your future careers decisions.